The storming of the Bastille occurred in Paris, France, on the morning of 14 July 1789. The medieval fortress and prison in Paris known as the Bastille represented royal authority in the center of Paris. The prison contained just 7 inmates at the time of its storming but was a symbol of the abuse of the monarchy. Its fall was the flashpoint of the French Revolution. In France, le 14 Juillet is a public holiday, usually called Bastille Day in English. Background: during the reign of Louis XVI, France faced a major economic crisis, partially initiated by the cost of intervening in the American Revolution, and exacerbated by a regressive system of taxation. On 5 May 1789, the Estates General of 1789 convened to deal with this issue, but were held back by archaic protocols and the conservatism of the Second Estate, consisting of the nobility and amounting to only 2% of France's population at the time. On 17 June 1789, the Third Estate, with its representatives drawn from the commoners, reconstituted themselves as the National Assembly, a body whose purpose was the creation of a French constitution. The king initially opposed this development, but was forced to acknowledge the authority of the Assembly, which subsequently renamed itself the National Constituent Assembly on 9 July. The commoners had formed the National Guard, sporting tricolour cockades of blue, white and red, formed by combining the red and blue cockade of Paris and the white cockade of the king. These cockades, and soon simply their colour scheme, became the symbol of the Revolution and, later, of France itself. Paris, close to insurrection and, in François Mignet's words, intoxicated with liberty and enthusiasm, showed wide support for the Assembly. The press published the Assembly's debates. Political debate spread beyond the Assembly itself into the public squares and halls of the capital. The Palais Royal and its grounds became the site of an endless meeting. The crowd, on the authority of the meeting at the Palais Royal, broke open the prisons of the Abbaye to release some grenadiers of the French Guards, reportedly imprisoned for refusing to fire on the people. The Assembly recommended the imprisoned guardsmen to the clemency of the king. They returned to prison, and received pardon. The rank and file of the regiment, previously considered reliable, now leaned toward the popular cause. Necker's dismissal. On the 11th of July 1789, with troops at Versailles, Chevreuse, the Champ de Mars, and Saint-Denis, Louis XVI, acting under the influence of the conservative nobles of his Privy Council, dismissed and banished his finance minister, Jacques Necker, who had been sympathetic to the Third Estate, and completely reconstructed the ministry. The marshals Victor François, Duc de Broglie, La Galissonière, the Duc de la Bourguignon, the Baron Louis de Breteuil, and the Intendant Foulon, took over the posts of Puy-Ségur, Armand Marc, Comte de Montmorin, La Luzerne, Saint-Priest, and Necker. News of Necker's dismissal reached Paris in the afternoon of Sunday, 12 July. The Parisians generally presumed that the dismissal marked the start of a coup by conservative elements. Liberal Parisians were further enraged by the fear that a concentration of royal troops, brought to Versailles from frontier garrisons, would attempt to shut down the National Constituent Assembly, which was meeting in Versailles. Crowds gathered throughout Paris, including more than 10,000 at the Palais Royal. Camille Desmoulins successfully rallied the crowd by mounting a table, pistol in hand, exclaiming, "Citizens, there is no time to lose. The dismissal of Necker is the knell of a Saint Bartholomew for patriots. This very night all the Swiss and German battalions will leave the Champ de Mars to massacre us all. One resources left to take arms. The Swiss and German regiments referred to were among the foreign mercenary troops who made up a significant portion of the pre-revolutionary Royal Army, and were seen as being less likely to be sympathetic to the popular cause than ordinary French soldiers. By early July, approximately half of the 25,000 regular troops in Paris and Versailles were drawn from these foreign regiments. The French regiments included in the concentration appear to have been selected either because of the proximity of their garrisons to Paris or because their colonels were supporters of the reactionary court party, opposed to reform. During the public demonstrations that started on 12 July, the multitude displayed busts of Necker and of Louis-Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, marching from the Palais Royal through the theatre district before continuing westward along the boulevards. The crowd clashed with the Royal German Cavalry Regiment between the Place Vendôme and the Tuileries Palace. From atop the Champs-Élysées, the Prince de Lamasque unleashed a cavalry charge which dispersed the remaining protesters at Place Louis XV, now Place de la Concorde. The royal commander, Baron de Bessenval, fearing the results of a bloodbath amongst the poorly armed crowds or defections amongst his own men, then withdrew the cavalry towards Chevreuse. Meanwhile, unrest was growing among the people of Paris, who expressed their hostility against state authorities by attacking customs posts blamed for causing increased food and wine prices. The people of Paris started to plunder any place where food, guns and supplies could be hoarded. That night, rumors spread that supplies were being hoarded at Saint Lazare, a huge property of the clergy, which functioned as convent, hospital, school and even as a jail. An angry mob broke in and plundered the property, seizing 52 wagons of wheat which were taken to the public market. That same day multitudes of people plundered many other places including weapon arsenals. The royal troops did nothing to stop the spreading of social chaos in Paris during those days. Armed conflict. The Regiment of Gardes Françaises formed the permanent garrison of Paris and, with many local ties, was favorably disposed towards the popular cause. This regiment had remained confined to its barracks during the initial stages of the mid-July disturbances, with Paris becoming the scene of a general riot. Charles Eugene, Prince of Lamasque, not trusting the regiment to obey his order, posted 60 dragoons to station themselves before its acute POT in the Chaussée d'Antin. Once again, a measure intended to restrain served only to provoke. The officers of the French Guards made ineffectual attempts to rally their men. The rebellious citizenry had now acquired a trained military contingent. As word of this spread, the commanders of the royal forces encamped on the Champ de Mars became doubtful of the dependability of even the foreign regiments. The future citizen king, Louis-Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, witnessed these events as a young officer and was of the opinion that the soldiers would have obeyed orders if put to the test. He also commented in retrospect that the officers of the French Guards had neglected their responsibilities in the period before the uprising, leaving the regiment too much to the control of its non-commissioned officers. However, the uncertain leadership of Bessenval led to a virtual abdication of royal authority in central Paris. Bourgeois militia arose through the 60 voting districts of Paris to take control over the insurrection, storming the Bastille. On the morning of 14 July 1789, the city of Paris was in a state of alarm. The partisans of the Third Estate in France, now under the control of the bourgeois militia of Paris, had earlier stormed the Hôtel des Invalides to gather arms, and were mainly seeking to acquire the large quantities of arms and ammunition stored at the Bastille. On the 14th, there were over 13,600 kilograms of gunpowder stored there. At this point, the Bastille was nearly empty of prisoners, housing only 7 old men annoyed by all the disturbance, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and 1 deviant aristocrat, the Comte de Salages. The cost of maintaining a medieval fortress and garrison for so limited a purpose had led to a decision being taken to close it. Shortly before the disturbances began, it was, however, a symbol of royal tyranny. The regular garrison consisted of 82 invalides. It had, however, been reinforced on 7 July by 32 grenadiers of the Swiss Salas-Samade regiment from the troops on the Champ de Mars. The walls mounted 18 8-pound guns and 12 smaller pieces. The governor was Bernard René de Launay, son of the previous governor and actually born within the Bastille. The list of vainqueurs de la Bastille has 954 names, and the total of the crowd was probably fewer than 1,000. The crowd gathered outside around mid-morning, calling for the surrender of the prison, the removal of the guns and the release of the arms and gunpowder. 2 representatives of the crowd outside were invited into the fortress and negotiations began, and another was admitted around noon with definite demands. The negotiations dragged on while the crowd grew and became impatient. Around 1:30, the crowd surged into the undefended outer courtyard, and the chains on the drawbridge to the inner courtyard were cut, crushing one unfortunate vainqueur. About this time, gunfire began, though some stories state that the governor had a cannon fire into the crowd, killing several women, children, and men, turning the crowd into a mob. The crowd seemed to have felt it had been drawn into a trap, and the fighting became more violent and intense. While attempts by deputies to organize a ceasefire were ignored by the attackers, the firing continued, and at 300, the attackers were reinforced by mutinous Gardes Françaises and other deserters from among the regular troops, along with 2 cannons. A substantial force of Royal Army troops encamped on the nearby Champs de Mars did not intervene. With the possibility of a mutual massacre suddenly apparent, Governor de Launay ordered a ceasefire at 500. A letter offering his terms was handed out to the besiegers through a gap in the inner gate. His demands were refused, but de Launay nonetheless capitulated. As he realized that his troops could not hold out much longer, he opened the gates to the inner courtyard, and the vainqueurs swept in to liberate the fortress at 5:30. 98 attackers and 1 defender had died in the actual fighting. De Launay was seized and dragged towards the Hôtel de Ville in a storm of abuse. Outside the hotel, a discussion as to his fate began. The badly beaten de Launay shouted, "Enough! Let me die," and kicked a pastry cook named Delight in the groin. De Launay was then stabbed repeatedly and fell, and his head was sawn off and fixed on a pike to be carried through the streets. The 3 officers of the permanent Bastille garrison were also killed by the crowd. Surviving police reports detailed their wounds and clothing. 2 of the invalides of the garrison were lynched, but all but 2 of the Swiss regulars of the Salis Samade regiment were protected by the French guards and eventually released to return to their regiment. Their officer, Lieutenant Louis de Fleu, wrote a detailed report on the defense of the Bastille which was incorporated in the logbook of the Salis Samade and has survived. It is critical of the dead Marquis de Launay, whom de Fleu accuses of weak and indecisive leadership. The blame for the fall of the Bastille would rather appear to lie with the inertia of the commanders of the substantial force of Royal Army troops encamped on the Champs de Mars, who made no effort to intervene when the nearby Hôtel des Invalides or the Bastille were attacked. Returning to the Hôtel de Ville, the mob accused the Prévôt Marchand Jacques de Flesselles of treachery, and he was assassinated en route to an ostensible trial at the Palais Royal. Aftermath. The king was informed of the storming only the next morning by the Duke of La Rochefoucauld. "Is it a revolt?" asked Louis XVI. The Duke replied, "No, sire, it's not a revolt, it's a revolution." The citizenry of Paris, expecting a counterattack, entrenched the streets, built barricades of paving stones, and armed themselves as well as they could, especially with improvised pikes. Meanwhile, at Versailles, the Assembly remained ignorant of most of the Paris events, but eminently aware that Marshal de Broglie stood on the brink of unleashing a pro-royalist coup to force the Assembly to adopt the order of the 23rd of June, and then to dissolve. The Viscount de Noailles apparently first brought reasonably accurate news of the Paris events to Versailles. M. Ganel and Bancal des Issarts, dispatched to the Hôtel de Ville, confirmed his report. By the morning of the 15th of July, the outcome appeared clear to the king as well, and he and his military commanders backed down. The royal troops concentrated around Paris were dispersed to their frontier garrisons. The Marquis de Lafayette took up command of the National Guard at Paris. Jean-Sylvain Bailly, leader of the Third Estate and instigator of the tennis court oath, became the city's mayor under a new governmental structure known as the Commune de Paris. The king announced that he would recall Necker and return from Versailles to Paris. On the 17th of July, in Paris, he accepted a tricolour cockade from Bailly and entered the Hôtel de Ville, with cries of "Long live the King" and "Long live the nation." Nonetheless, after this violence, nobles, little assured by the apparent and, as it was to prove, temporary reconciliation of king and people, started to flee the country as émigrés. Early émigrés included the Comte d'Artois and his two sons, the Prince de Condé, the Prince de Conti, the Polignac family, and Charles-Alexandre de Calonne, the former finance minister. They settled at Turin, where Calonne, as agent for the Count d'Artois and the Prince de Condé, began plotting civil war within the kingdom and agitating for a European coalition against France. The successful insurrection at Paris spread throughout France. In accord with principles of popular sovereignty and with complete disregard for claims of royal authority, the people created a parallel structure of municipalities for civic government and militia for civic protection. In rural areas, many went beyond this. Some burned title deeds and no small number of chateaux, as the Great Fear spread across the countryside during the weeks of the 20th of July to the 5th of August, with attacks on wealthy landlords impelled by the belief that the aristocracy was trying to put down the revolution. On July 22, 1789, Joseph Foulon de Douai and his son-in-law were beheaded by the populace. Pierre-François Palloy was given a commission of disassembling the building and commenced work immediately. Austrian composer Karl Ditters von Dittersdorf wrote his symphony in C major as a tribute to the event. The first movement of the piece is known as La Prise de la Bastille. In Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, the Defarges help lead the assault on the Bastille. During the second book, in 1790, the cast-iron, 1 pound, 3 ounce key to the Bastille was given to American President George Washington by Lafayette. Washington displayed it prominently at government facilities and events in New York and Philadelphia until shortly before his retirement in 1797. The key continues to be displayed at Washington's residence of Mount Vernon.